learning about the features of a sine graph. And so one of these features is that a sine graph goes to the origin. However, the graph displayed does not go to the origin, and that is because this graph has a downward vertical shift of 1. So if we were to move this entire graph up by 1, then this graph would indeed go to the origin. Now, moving on, the midline of a graph is the middle portion of a graph. So what we can do to find the midline of this graph is to take the maximum value of y for this graph, which is 1, and add it with the minimum value of y for this graph, which is -3. And so we add these two numbers up and we average them. And so it'll look something like this, where we have the maximum value of y, which is 1, plus the minimum value of y, which is -3, and we're going to average these two numbers out by dividing it by 2, but by dividing them by 2, and our midline is then -1. And so we need to know the midline in order to know the amplitude of this graph, because the amplitude of the graph is how high and how low the graph will be from the midline. And so what we're going to do to find the amplitude of this graph is to take the maximum value of y, which is 1, and subtract it with the minimum value with the midline. And so we get 1, which is the maximum value of y, minus -1, which is the minimum value of y. Which is the midline. So we have 1 minus -1, and that equals 2. So right here is our amplitude of 2. And so another way to solve for the amplitude, or to find the amplitude, is you can also start from the midline. So we have -1 minus the minimum value of y, which is -3, and we get something like so. So midline, -1, minus the minimum value of y, which is -3, and so we have that equal to 2. So our amplitude is 2. Now moving on, the period of the graph, a period is equivalent to 1 cycle, and so what we can do to find the period of this graph is to begin at a starting point, like 0 and -1. So we have y equals -1, and so our period or cycle is complete when y equals -1 again, and it has the same slope as the slope we started with in the beginning. So right here we have a positive slope, so our period or our cycle is complete when y equals -1 and our slope is positive as well. So if we go along the graph, we get to this point where y equals -1. However, this is not where the period ends, because the slope right here is negative, and it's not the same as the initial slope that we started with. We started with the positive slope, and this is a negative slope. So we're going to keep on going, and eventually we get to this point right here where y equals -1, and we have a positive slope like how we started with before. So we have our initial points here and our final point here. This is where our period ends. And so now to find the period, we look at our x values. So initially we started at x equals 0 and we ended at x equals 3. So to find this length right here, we're going to do 3 minus 0. And so this length right here, which is our period, the length of our period, is 3. So now if you're curious to know how the features look like in an equation, they will look something like this, where y equals 2 sine 2 pi over 3x minus 1. This 2 right here is the amplitude that we found, which was 2, and the 3 right here is the period, which is 3, and this -1 is the vertical shift that I was referring to in the beginning of the video.